Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Latin America's Democratic Crusade, the Transnational Struggle Against Dictatorship, 1920s to 1960s, by Alan Wells, narrated by Alan Wells. For David, Emily, and Anna. Soldiers with pen or sword for the liberty of humankind against the dictatorships of America. Alberto Bayo, 1950. Introduction. In July 1958, 2 months after Vice President Richard Nixon was taunted and pelted with rocks and trash, and his limousine smashed by baseball bats in Caracas, Venezuela, during an ill-fated goodwill tour through South America, a 37-year-old first-term member of Congress from Oregon drew an enthusiastic crowd of 20,000 who cheered his every word at a political rally at the Nuevo Circo bull ring in the Venezuelan capital. This reception was hardly unique. Representative Charles Porter had just drawn effusive crowds in Puerto Rico, Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia. How did a political neophyte who barely spoke a word of Spanish become an overnight sensation, earning the moniker Latin America's representative in the U.S. Congress? What resonated so well was Porter's championing of democracy and his searing criticism of Washington's coddling of brutal, corrupt dictatorships such as Fulgencio Batista, Anastasio Somoza, and Rafael Trujillo. Nixon, who chalked up his hostile reception to communist agitators, scarcely left the U.S. Embassy for the duration of his visit, canceling much of his itinerary and cutting short his stay. The Vice President needed a superabundant military escort just to leave the country. So concerned was Dwight Eisenhower about the safety of the Vice President, his wife Pat, and the rest of their entourage, that he rattled sabers by dispatching 1,000 Marines and paratroopers from North Carolina to Guantanamo and Ramey Air Force Base in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico, and ordered the Navy to send 6 destroyers, a missile cruiser, and an aircraft carrier to the area. By comparison, Representative Porter's visit was a love-in. His jam-packed schedule featured wide-ranging interviews with the press and a local television station, and meetings with leaders of the major political parties, the president of the Provisional Junta, labor organizers, and the Venezuelan Chamber of Commerce. In addition, he participated in a 3-hour roundtable at the Central University, a notorious leftist hotbed, where anti-American feelings ran high, and 2 campus dormitories bore the nicknames Stalingrad I and II. No matter, the opinionated Oregonian gave as good as he got, and while Nixon's meetings were held at the embassy for security reasons, Porter, according to one local newspaper account, sampled comida criolla, native cuisine, and met with Venezuelans in their own element, where he was received as if he were at home. The congressman's message could not have been more dissimilar from Nixon's Cassandra-like warnings about the communist threat. At the Plaza de Toros, for instance, Porter commended those in attendance for their participation in the popular upheaval that had ousted General Marcos Pérez Jiménez from power 7 months earlier. He framed the restoration of democratic rule in Venezuela as part and parcel of an unmistakable hemispheric trend. Pérez Jiménez is overthrown. Trujillo is teetering. Batista's days are numbered. Paraguayan dictator Alfredo Stroessner and Somoza know they must soon answer to their people for their sins. He also had strong words for Venezuela's military, lecturing them to defend their country, not to try to govern it. In appreciation of his message, the packed house at the bullring waved white handkerchiefs, an honor usually reserved for gallant bullfighters. Porter was deeply moved by the tribute. The reception he received in Caracas and elsewhere during his visits to other Latin American capitals indicates that on the eve of the Cuban Revolution, a transnational battle against the region's dictatorships was foremost in the minds of many. Latin Americans' very different responses to an inveterate Cold Warrior like Nixon and a liberal critic raise intriguing questions about why scholars persist in framing the Cold War as a Manichaean battle between left and right, one in which the global South is cast as either a witting or an unwitting proxy. What if that era were told from the perspective of the many who preferred reform instead of revolution? Just as Latin America became a flashpoint of the Cold War as a result of the Cuban Revolution, reformers, unhappy with what they viewed as Washington's and Moscow's simplistic us versus them mindset, forged a different path, rejecting right-wing militarism and leftist totalitarianism. Politicians like José Pepe Figueres of Costa Rica, Rómulo Betancourt of Venezuela, Alberto Lleras Camargo of Colombia, Victor Paz Estensorro of Bolivia, Juan Bosch of Dominican Republic, Ramón Villeda Morales of Honduras, and Eduardo Frei of Chile came to power in the 1950s and 1960s, articulating policies that would have resonated with New Dealers: electoral democracy, a safety net for the poor, the curbing of exploitative monopolies, and a modest agrarian reform. They may have opposed the policies of a particular administration in Washington, but they never once questioned the inevitability of North American hegemony in the hemisphere. Reformers built formidable political machines, enlisting the support of tens of thousands of professionals, teachers, students, small business owners, union rank and file, and peasants. How does the periodization of the Cold War as a discrete era hinder our own understanding of the region's political evolution during the 20th century? Latin America's democratic crusade boldly contends that the Cold War came late to Latin America. Until the Cuban Revolution, the battle was not between capitalism and communism for many Latin Americans. That was Washington's abiding preoccupation, but democracy versus dictatorship. Beginning in the 1920s, the fight against authoritarianism was contested on multiple fronts: political, ideological, and cultural, taking on the dimensions of a crusade. Grafted onto this extended conflict was a belated Cold War with all its convulsions. Indeed, the political aftershocks of the struggle between reformers and dictators are still felt today, long after the Cold War ended. Broad multi-class parties, such as Venezuela's Acción Democrática, AD, the Peruvian Alianza Popular Revolucionaria Americana, or APRA, Colombia's Liberal Party, Costa Rica's Partido Liberación Nacional, the PLN, Chile's Christian Democrats, and Argentina's Radical Party enjoyed widespread support in contrast to the region's weak, fractious leftist parties, which were badly tarnished by opportunistic alliances with dictators. One might presume that leftists were the chief preoccupation of autocrats, but social democrats and their followers troubled them far more. Reformers earned the respect of their political base because for decades they had fought courageously against tyranny. As student activists in the 1920s and 30s, they battled the region's many caudillos and the repressive militaries and reactionary oligarchies that propped them up. Experiencing partial victories, bitter defeats, repression and exile, members of this historical generation were marked in ways that would not become fully apparent until they were much older. Some owed an intellectual debt to the Mexican Revolution, while others dabbled with communism before cutting ties with what they concluded was an imported, rigid ideology ill-suited to local realities. Student militants also forged ties with like-minded peers throughout the hemisphere and cultivated the support of progressives in Europe and the United States. When they became the political establishment of the 1950s and 1960s, they replicated this strategy, reaching out to liberal politicians such as Porter, as well as to leaders of the U.S. labor movement, academics, and journalists. Just as reformers built cosmopolitan alliances, so too did dictators, a phenomenon that Venezuela's Betancourt aptly called La Internacional de la Espada, the International of the Sword. That informal pact enabled dictators to extend their reach far beyond the confines of national borders. A tyrant like Trujillo could act with impunity, eliminating dissidents and political rivals abroad. He hounded dissidents relentlessly in the diaspora and purposefully destabilized democratic governments that were in league with his political enemies. Strategies that the Dominican dictator honed on the island to guarantee his political survival were exported with deadly effect. He even went so far as to hire pistoleros, or gunmen, to assassinate the elected heads of state of Haiti, Cuba, Venezuela, Costa Rica, and Guatemala. Moreover, Trujillo and his peers in La Internacional knew just how to curry favor in Washington, tarring and feathering their opponents with a red brush. They, too, built transnational networks, expending what for their poor countries were vast sums to lobby anti-communist politicians on the Hill. Convinced that La Internacional represented an existential threat to their cause, reformers declared that no civilian government was safe until the cancer of dictatorship was excised entirely from the hemisphere. Where they were sorely mistaken was in their unshakable belief that democratic rule was inevitable, that their authoritarian enemies were on the verge of extinction, and that the future was theirs. Bedeviling their efforts was the eminence gris of La Internacional, the Argentine general Juan Perón, whose diplomats and labor attachés were, in the words of Betancourt, conspiring, whispering, and encouraging fellow strongmen to defend their interests against the region's democracies. Also lending inspiration to La Internacional was the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco, who hosted sumptuous state visits for his Latin American brethren. Especially problematic for Democrats was Washington's cozying up to the region's dictatorships. Indeed, successive Democratic and Republican administrations were not only loath to criticize authoritarian regimes, but by providing military and economic assistance, they made it easy for the armies to repress the internal opposition and to subvert neighboring democracies. To be sure, reformers paid a high price for their principles. Some were murdered, and many were tortured, imprisoned, or spent years in exile. Often they found common cause with ideologically diverse exiles who populated the capitals of the Caribbean, as well as Mexico City, Miami, New York, and Paris. An understated feature of the war against dictatorships was the willing and able participation of battle-tested Spanish Civil War veterans. Hardened by the fight against fascism in Europe, exiled Spanish Republicans brought both convictions and military expertise to the circum-Caribbean theater. Even a confirmed Marxist like Alberto Bayo appreciated the importance of the democratic crusade against La Internacional, personally risking life and limb to oust Somoza. Years before he instructed the likes of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara on the finer points of guerrilla warfare, the author of this book's epigraph dedicated his 1950 memoir, Tempestad en el Caribe, to those intrepid soldiers with pen or sword fighting against the dictatorships of America. Among those Bayo singled out for special commendation were Betancourt, Figueres, Bosch, and the Guatemalan president Juan José Arévalo, who governed from 1944 to 1950. Indeed, multiple political agendas were in play, official and informal, legal and unlawful, with a host of political actors seeking to shape and influence the course of reform and U.S.-Latin American relations. The collective efforts of Democrats and their allies did not go unrewarded. Between 1952 and 1961, 10 dictators either stepped down voluntarily or were driven from power. Cold warriors like Nixon and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles viewed this democratic wave with trepidation, convinced that strongmen were more likely to thwart communist infiltration than Democrats. In fact, U.S. foreign policy goals remained remarkably consistent and bipartisan for much of the century. Washington sought to preserve its sphere of influence in Latin America, to contain international communism, protect and defend the investments of its nationals and corporations, promote regional stability, and ensure support for its policies. As Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Henry Holland put it matter-of-factly in 1955, "The objective of United States inter-American policy is to persuade the Latin American governments and peoples to adhere to our political and economic policy." It should come as little surprise that a young Fidel Castro received material assistance from reformers while he was in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Betancourt and Figueres were persuaded that the young Cubans' fight was theirs. That is, until Castro embraced communism. Fidel's early calls for continental unity against authoritarianism and his attempts to oust Trujillo, Somoza, and Haiti's François Duvalier in the spring and summer of 1959 appeared to validate moderate support for the young comandante. Watchful waiting, however, soon gave way to disillusionment, especially after Cuba's bear hug of the Soviet Union. The revolution's sudden radicalization, its provision of assistance to budding leftist insurgencies across the region, and Washington's determination to prevent another Cuba from happening elsewhere placed reformers in an untenable position, necessitating the taking of sides. The bitter half-century fight left its mark on reformers. It is no small irony that when they finally achieved political success, these Democrats governed with a heavy hand. Now, ensnared in the Cold War's web, they turned on a new generation of politicized students who were enamored of Castro's revolution. For their part, student activists ridiculed their political elders, calling them bourgeois lapdogs of imperialism, while scheming to depose them. After 1960, moderates had the ear of the Kennedy administration, which implemented both altruistic and counterinsurgent strategies. As guerrilla insurgency escalated, reformers fought a rearguard action against the right and the left that circumscribed their options, undermining their legitimacy at home and abroad. A new generation of military commanders quickly concluded that civilian politicians were too weak to defeat leftist subversion, so they restored authoritarian rule in 8 countries between 1962 and 1964. Coupled with the unanticipated emergence of the United States and Cuba as parties to the region's long-standing border wars, the few remaining democracies were forced to tack to the right, moderate their agendas, and align their foreign policies with Washington's. Just as a democratic wave gained momentum, Havana, Washington, and Moscow indelibly altered the hemisphere's political calculus. Most of the new democracies thus became casualties of a belated Cold War. Porter, too, paid a price for his candor. His principled stance unleashed a concerted campaign by his political opponents, and a once promising career was derailed at the polls in 1960. By the end of the decade, repressive military regimes, noticeably more ideological than their predecessors, dominated the political landscape, as hundreds of thousands perished on the hemisphere's killing fields. I became acquainted with this democratic crusade while researching an international history of Central European refugees who fled one racist dictator, Hitler, and were then welcomed by another. The refugees and their donors rallied to Trujillo's defense after he was widely criticized for having his henchmen abduct a prominent dissident off the streets of New York in 1956. When the despot tried to cover his tracks by silencing those linked to the disappearance, he inadvertently turned Representative Porter into the darling of reformers. Until recently, students of U.S. Latin American relations during the Cold War era, relying heavily on U.S. diplomatic records, have adhered uncritically to an East-West binary, obscuring as much as it reveals about the multifaceted nature of inter-American relations during this turbulent period. To give but one example, an otherwise splendid synthesis correlates the region's history during those decades with the accepted North American periodization of the conflict. As the historian Greg Grandin related, the Latin American Cold War began not in 1959 with the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, nor in 1954 with the United States' first intervention in Guatemala, but in the years following World War II. Several innovative anthologies which counter the traditional over-reliance on English-language materials by tapping sources in Latin American archives to illuminate the Cold War's impact at the grassroots remain wedded to that binary. Not surprisingly, state terror, guerrilla insurgencies, dirty wars, mass graves, and the plight of the desaparecidos monopolize the literature, and much of that is filtered through the prism of U.S. Latin American relations. Too often, historical counts of what preceded 1959 became an exercise in teleology, markers set down anticipating the Cuban Revolution's arrival. Meanwhile, moderates are scarcely mentioned. Why has much of the scholarship relegated reformism to an ephemeral role? My research underscores that hemispheric relations were not just reflected in an East-West mirror. They were also refracted through the lenses of Latin American liberalism and nationalism. Until now, the literature has largely glossed over reformers and their accomplishments, or, alternatively, has written them off as vendepatrias, sellouts, or ineffectual, careerist politicians who stymied meaningful reform. That scholarship privileges the national context, neglects the movement's transnational character, and accentuates the period when reformers came of political age during the Cold War. Furthermore, studies of these politicians, whether in Spanish or English, are often uncritical or unabashedly partisan. Absent is a fine-grained examination of why these movements resonated so deeply for many Latin Americans across the 20th century. In keeping with the latest scholarship in international history, I illustrate how both internal and external forces affected the prospects for democratic rule in nations where reformers enjoyed sustained success, most notably but not exclusively in Venezuela, Costa Rica, and Colombia, and where they petered out or failed, for example, Cuba, Peru, the Dominican Republic. While much of the attention here is devoted to the countries of the Caribbean littoral, where the struggle for democratic rule was joined between the 1920s and the 1960s, similar battles were ongoing to a greater or lesser degree in the Southern Cone and the Andean region as well. Latin American Democrats' decades-long fight to overcome authoritarian rule has much to teach us at a time when our own political institutions appear increasingly fragile, when there have been once unthinkable calls in some quarters for our armed forces to crush domestic discontent, where at home and abroad a flagrant disregard for the rule of law by populist strongmen has been increasingly normalized, and when terms like coup, insurrection, disinformation, and the big lie are no longer considered artifacts of a distant time and place. Comparisons across political cultures and eras are always fraught, but Latin America's reformers, who had first-hand experience with all of these disturbing trends, learned at their peril that democracy could not be taken for granted and had to be defended at any cost. What's in a label? The politicians at the heart of this study initially referred to themselves as democratic leftists, a descriptor they may have aspired to during their formative years. But over time, as circumstances dictated their pivot away from a progressive agenda, became a political albatross. They did not help their cause by making repeated promises to bring about a revolution in their respective societies. Also complicating matters was that early on, some reformers proudly declared that they were democratic socialists. By the late 1940s, however, anything that hinted at socialism became a distinct liability, and not just with policymakers in Washington. Dictators and their conservative allies were quick to pounce on reformers' earlier admissions to paint them as fellow travelers or communists. Leftists, of course, never missed the chance to highlight the disparity between what their rivals promised and how modest their accomplishments really were. Reformers did enjoy several advantages over their leftist competitors. While they were not averse to invoking Marxist precepts, especially when they denounced foreign investors, they were not constrained by ideological orthodoxy and enjoyed much greater latitude when it came to how and when they rallied their supporters. In contrast, the region's communist parties had to wait for the right objective conditions before mobilizing their supporters, and even then, not before seeking the approval of a notoriously cautious Comintern. In addition, reformers' emphasis on bread-and-butter trade union demands often gave them a leg up in the fight to win over organized labor. They also had the luxury of casting themselves as homegrown, a feature that parties reputed to be joined at the hip to Moscow could not gainsay. On the other hand, since moderates posed a far more formidable threat to the political establishment, they were much more likely to experience repression. Some political theorists classify reformers as populists or proto-populists. Unfortunately, such terms have been applied to so many different historical actors, militarists, civilian politicians, progressives, reactionaries, that the terminology has almost lost its meaning. The more successful populists, such as Perón and Brazil's Getúlio Vargas, were charismatic leaders who built lasting political movements. Decrying politics as usual, they denounced real and imagined members of the political establishment while invoking a black-and-white struggle between the people and their adversaries. For example, oligarchs, foreign companies, Washington, even unwanted immigrants. Enemies of the state were labeled traitors or instruments of foreign powers. Although they were elected to office, once in power, populist politicians evinced scant respect for democratic norms or the rule of law. Under their watch, legislatures and judiciaries became rubber stamps to an omnipotent executive branch.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?